Would everyone ensure that all electronic devices are turned off or switched to silent mode? Tea and coffee are not allowed in the committee room. And we are continuing line by line consideration of the terminally ill adults end of life bill. And can I just remind members that the most valuable of all talents is never using two words when one will do. And I take that from Thomas Jefferson. Thank you very much. We now come to Amendment 290 to Clause 5 in the name of Rachel Maskell, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendments 185, 335, 52, 359, 186, Amendment A to Amendment 186, 340, 427, 20, 336, 337 and new Clause 12. Naishar.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move Amendment 290 in the name of my honourable friend from York Central. Clarity is needed as to who a medical practitioner is. With the regulations on a physician's associate, there was much dis-ease by the BMA and others on the role and function of this new profession. Whilst not wanting to debate the merit of this today, it is clear that being involved in an assisted dying process requires someone of significant experience in being able to support a patient whilst undertaking complex assessments and coordinating their care between specialists and others. In some jurisdictions, Chair, we have heard that clinicians have extensive clinical experience where they do not in others. Therefore, being able to determine the level of experience and competencies of the medical practitioner is important to ensure that the patient is receiving care from someone who has significant practice expertise. A doctor in training, whether as a specialist or general practitioner, whilst making very significant clinical decisions, should not be deemed as having the experience, competencies or breadth of experience for the purposes of this process. An associate practitioner should also be deemed as not reaching these thresholds. This clause amendment would therefore show the person and the public more widely that the person who would act as the coordinating doctor held such experience, and there was no doubt of this standing to register for such a role. Already the public can be confused as to the exact status of the clinician they are under, or indeed the profession itself. So putting in this safeguard would ensure that the patient's interests are upheld. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The Amendment 290 to Clause 5 was in the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship in this session. I rise to speak in support of Amendment 185 in the name of the sponsor of the bill regarding training requirements that need to be made by regulation. And it's placing a duty on the Secretary of State to make regulations about the training qualifications and experience required in order to act as a coordinating doctor. And similarly, 186, that these should specifically include training relating to the assessment of capacity and assessing whether a person is being coerced or pressured by any other person. Also in Clause 5, subsection 3c, makes provision that the required training, qualifications or experience is to be determined by a person specified in regulations. And I think that reflection of expertise in making those regulations is vitally important. And we've heard from many of the experts who gave us evidence about the importance of training, development, mentorship, which we'd expect to see in those regulations. I think placing those requirements in regulations means it can be developed through consultation with those experts, with stakeholders, gaining a wide range of feedback, and I think it also future-proofs the requirement of any training to be developed to strengthen them as through experience in the future, which is another reason why I think this is really important. Those key principles as part of the safeguards in this proposed bill around assessing capacity and potential coercion are really important, and actually they are those safeguards on the face of the bill. And so I'm actually minded to press the honourable member, the sponsor, to support Amendment 20 in the name of the member for Lowestoft. The regulations must specify training in respect of domestic abuse, including coercive control and financial abuse, is included as mandatory, and this would provide further clarity further strengthen training around assessing, coercion in all senses of the word as part of this process and as part of the safeguards, which many members, even in the earlier debates, have said that it's so important that they see those safeguards. So I agree, and I hope that the sponsoring member would seek to support Amendment 20 as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Daniel Francis.
Thank you, Chair. I rise initially to speak to the amendments which are in my name, namely New Clause 12, 336, 337, 335, in the first instance. So yesterday we spoke about the evidence we received from the British Medical Association, and again with regard to those amendments which stand in my name, and I accept that there is some crossover with the amendments from the sponsor on training in those issues. But the position of the British Medical Association on the 4 amendments in my name is that they strongly urge MPs to support these amendments, which would define the training explicitly in the bill as specialised training to provide assisted dying undertaken by those who opt in. They've been vocal that the bill should be based on an opt-in model during the committee's oral evidence sessions, and they believe reinforcing this through New Clause 12 and Amendments 335 to 337 would make 2 important aspects of this provision in the bill clearer. Firstly, that providing assisted dying is not and would not in the future be expected of all doctors. They say the bill's current or encompassing reference simply to training does not preclude this training being prescribed as standard general medical training by the regulations, in which case it would apply to all doctors and make the opt-in redundant. Specifying that it's specialised training on the face of the bill and making clearer that there is no obligation on doctors to undergo the training would safeguard the opt-in model in the bill's first principles. Secondly, they state that only those who undergo specialised tailored training on assisted dying could provide the service. And again, during the oral evidence sessions, they said there's been much discussion about the importance of specialised training for those who opt in to carry out the service. Specialised training for those providing the service is essential for doctors and provides additional protection and safeguards for patients, and that it should be explicitly referenced in the bill. We also heard in our oral evidence sessions from others, including Dr. Amidze, on the need for training. He said, I personally believe it would be advantageous if there were formal training, as Dr. Clark has mentioned, specifically to have the kinds of conversations that we now talk about, such as about psychological issues and suicidal tendencies. I now turn to the 2 amendments in my name, 340 and 186A, which is an amendment to the Valley's amendment. Those issues relate to training, again, for those with learning disabilities and autism. I know we had a similar discussion on a previous clause, and again, I do know there's likely to be further amendments tabled on that matter, but as I said yesterday, they currently don't stand on the order paper. I hear what my honourable friend from Luton South has said about Amendment 20, and I welcome that. Again, that training on Amendment 20 being on the face of the bill is hugely important, and I believe that that's the same position with regard to Amendments 340 and 186A on those issues on training for those with learning disability and autism, particularly given the concerns that we've heard long and hard from myself and others about where we end up on Clause 3 of the bill relating to the Mental Capacity Act 2005. So, in that regard, Chair, I do... You were very... just in time then.
I thank him for these amendments and agree with principle. My concern is that still, again, people with mental disorders are left out. Does he agree with me that if there was a way to amend the bill later so that they could be incorporated in these proposals, that would be a positive step forward?
Thanks, Chair. I would welcome that would be a positive step forward. I think there's still some work to do, most probably. I will be having conversations with my honourable friends on the wording of that. But as I say, at the moment, these are the amendments that stand before us. There are not, the other amendments do not currently stand before us. for members to consider. So members do need to consider it with the amendments which currently stand here. So in that regard, Chair, I do formally move the 6 amendments in my name: New Clause 12, 336, 337, 335, 340.
Will you give way?
Very, just in time.
I would say very, very gently to my honourable friend, and as he knows, I have a great deal of respect for him, that if there are similar future amendments that he brings forward later in the bill, I'd be delighted to talk to him, but not least would really ask him to include mental disorders in the piece for similar amendments.
I hear that, and I think myself and my honourable friend are on the same page on much of these matters, and I think there was, some drafting issues that I discussed with amendments with MenCap at an earlier stage. I will finish sentence. So the 5 amendments I've already mentioned, and in addition, I'll formally move 186A, Chair. Thank you very much.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just quickly indicate my support for the amendments tabled by the honourable gentleman, also the amendments 290 in the name of the member for York Central, and the amendment 20 in the name of the member for Lowestoft about specific training on domestic abuse and coercive control. But I want to speak briefly to my own amendments, Mr. Chairman, which would require there to be a preliminary discussion before the signing of the first 4. At the moment, the bill allows someone to make the first declaration and state, I wish to be provided with assistance to end my own life, without any preparatory discussion about what that entails. And I think it's significant that in evidence we heard from Professor House, the Professor of Old Age Psychiatry, that the preferences of the person doing the assessment can bias the capacity assessment. So, as he explains, we're much more likely to declare somebody has capacity when they say they want to have the treatment that we're offering to them. But can we really be sure that, that the request is freely made and that it reflects the patient's wishes? The fact is, under the framing of the bill, we still don't fully know how it will be implemented, but the assessor is likely to be one of probably a small number of doctors who are willing to do this work on the NHS, or somebody who's working for a private provider. And research suggests that the assessing physician's own personal values and opinions may bias their judgment of a person's mental capacity. I mean, effectively what they're saying is that the doctor says you have capacity for the treatment he or she wants you to have, or believes that you should have. So I think that's significant. And we see from other jurisdictions where the assessment process can quickly become a tick box exercise in which there is not proper consideration given to what might be going on behind the declared wish. So in Oregon, in 2023, only 3 people were referred for a psychiatric evaluation by the assessing doctor, down from 33% in the early years. So there's clearly the evaluators have become less cautious when they come to sign that initial paperwork. In California, less than 1% of patients requesting an assisted death are referred for a mental health assessment. Again, I think these are significant warning signs for us. Now, I'm aware that the member for Spen Valley has tabled, I think, a helpful amendment 419 to clause 6, which is the clause dealing with the requirement for a proof of identity. As I was saying yesterday, this retrofits a requirement for a preliminary discussion before the process can proceed. I think it's good that she recognises the point that proper preliminary assessment must be done before the declaration is signed. I simply don't quite understand why that should be in clause 6. Surely it should be here in clause 5, in a single consistent place, when the coordinating doctor first meets the patient to witness their form. So I hope we might recognise that if the principle has been conceded by the amendment from the Honourable Lady, perhaps we should actually put that change into its rightful place. At the moment, it's also worth noting that you could get a proxy to sign for you. And that proxy doesn't need to know the patient, doesn't need to be known to you, it just needs to be a person of good standing in the community. And they need to undertake no training at all. We're talking about the importance of training in this grouping. The proxy who signs on your behalf does not need to have any training to inform the judgment that, I quote, they're satisfied the person understands the nature and effect of the making of the decision. So frankly, a stranger to the person, not a medic, must consign that declaration on your behalf, and at the moment they can do so without a preliminary discussion taking place. At the moment, it's only after making that crucial declaratory statement the coordinating doctor discusses the person's diagnosis. So I welcome the introduction of 419, but as I say, I think it's in the wrong place, and if we don't ensure that that preliminary discussion does take place here when we're just debating this group, it might be too late if 419 doesn't pass, or indeed if it's unsatisfactory, as I think it is, because I think at the moment there's a related problem. Quickly, Mr. Chairman, and I'll finish with this: that 419 does allow the preliminary doctor to confirm that the coordinating doctor to confirm that a preliminary discussion has taken place. So it could have taken place before the first declaration. In a sense, that's welcome, because I think it should be taking place. But it doesn't have to take place with the coordinating doctor. So the coordinating doctor, who is taking responsibility for the whole process of the assisted death for this patient, is not required to have this preliminary discussion themselves, not required to go through the very important process of properly discussing and informing, the assisted death and informing the patient of what it entails and what the other options are. So I think it's the amendment that, in my name, it enhances the significance of the preliminary discussion. It means that the doctor who witnesses the declaration, who coordinates the process of the assisted death, has had the fullest possible discussion with the patient, and that they genuinely take responsibility for guaranteeing that the patient is fully informed and aware of all of their options. So I do urge the committee to support these amendments as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz Saville-Roberts.
David, thank you very much, Chair. And I'm very glad that this amendment has now been unstarred for today, because it develops on what I initiated yesterday with 413, when we were in that stage identifying the preferred language of the individual, whether that is Welsh and English. Now, of course, if we identify the preferred language of an individual, we would then take every step to make sure that we satisfy that we provide services in their preferred language. But it also recognised that when we're talking about specific individuals, possibly in a specific location, whether that actually is possible or not. And I've tried to reflect that in using the terminology, all reasonable steps that the practitioner has fluent proficiency in Welsh, if that is the preferred language of the individual with whom they are conducting the initial conversation. Bear in mind, of course, that these practitioners who can hold a conversation with fluent proficiency in Welsh will also be able to hold a conversation in fluent proficiency in English as well. Now, the all reasonable steps phraseology comes from legislation already extant in Wales in relation to educational tribunals, which again recognise that it may not be possible to find an individual with sufficient proficiency. And we're trying to find a balance here in the pressure of time, being able to move ahead without having a bureaucratic thicket, but also acknowledging that if we do recognise an individual's preferred language, that we do take all reasonable steps. This, again, as yesterday, was an amendment that I made having met with an officer from the Welsh Language Commissioner's office last week. It would therefore establish a pathway for people for whom Welsh is their preferred language. Now, again, reflecting the comments from the Minister and the sponsor member yesterday, I need to know, and I think the committee needs to know, and the legislation needs to know, and I think the Senate as well needs to know, whether this needs to be on the face of the bill or whether it would be elsewhere. So I do not intend to push this to a vote today, although I rise to move it. I do not intend to push this to a vote, but I think that we very much need clarity on this, and I suspect that possibly this may not be so easy to clarify as yesterday's point. But we do need, if we're talking about the rights of individuals in one of the most difficult, emotional, intimate discussions of their lives, the need to reflect that they have a clear right to use the language which they have a choice in law to choose to use. I think we really need to make sure that we get everything correct on this bill. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you. Marshall.
Thank you, Chair. I rise to speak to the Amendment 20 by the Honourable friend. Yes, sorry, I've forgotten which constituency she's from. Key points for myself, really, are doctors are not specialists in coercive control, and this gives them training to spot abusive and coercive relationships, which are difficult to detect. domestic abuse and coercive control has disproportionate effect on women and disabled people. And if we just rely on doctors' experience to detect coercive control and abuse, they are more likely to miss cases. Some doctors will be more experienced or more perceptive than others. This amendment is not a perfect safeguard, but it will improve doctors' chances of stopping people being coerced. Apologies, Chair. It was a member for Lowestoft's amendment. It ensures that coordinating doctors must have undertaken training on domestic abuse, including coercive control and financial abuse. This is a significant and distinct amendment. In particular, it addresses the issue of repeated coercive control, which is so far overlooked in this bill. Amendments seeking to improve safeguards against coercion which do not address this issue of repeated coercive behaviour are, I believe, inadequate to protect vulnerable people, particularly women. It is regrettable that we did not hear from any experts in repeat coercive control in our witness sessions. Such testimony would have been valuable for understanding why the specific environment puts people at risk in regard to this bill. We have spoken a great deal about coercion already in this committee, and other members have referred to that. We have raised concerns about someone coercing another into assisted dying in a one-off incident. But we have not yet discussed the very real issue of repeated coercive control and what it means to live in this environment, and the implications that this bill may have for people in these situations. Dr. Hannah Deno submitted written evidence to this committee. She said, "As a doctor, I am not trained to detect coercion, and I do not believe that the bill pays sufficient attention to the detection of those who are under pressure from themselves or others to end their lives." The bill describes 2 independent medical assessments. Both can be carried out by doctors who have never previously met or cared for the patient. It is true that Dr. Deno... Yeah, happy to give way.
I thank you for giving way. Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I just want to provide some reassurance to the member that I have met with the member for Lowestoft and I will be supporting her Amendment 20 today, and I hope that provides some reassurance.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Member for Spen Valley for that intervention, and I'm very really grateful that she's accepting that amendment. However, the reason I'm going to go through the speech is I don't think it goes far enough in terms of the safeguards for this bill. So I'm going to make some progress in this speech from where I was. Bear with me. And then I'll come on to some of the issues that aren't addressed in this particular amendment and go further, just to highlight some of my concerns. Going back to what Dr. Hannah Deno submitted, she's not trained. She said she's not trained to detect coercion. It is also true that Dr. Deno went on to say social workers are better placed to screen for coercion, but are not mentioned in the bill. My honourable friend for Spen Valley has since tabled an amendment that would mandate a social worker to sit on a panel that would consider each application for assisted death. But I'm afraid I must repeat several points about these panels which have been made frequently. These panels are under no obligation to interview the applicant for assisted death in person. They may do so if they have concerns, but they may not. That will make it harder for panel members to detect possible coercion. So in the absence of any mechanism that would inform people who know assisted dying applicants and would thereby enable them to report concerns and that person was being coerced into this form of action, and the panels are not used in that way, in that multidisciplinary panels are, multidisciplinary panels are in the NHS, to decide on a pathway for a patient. Rather, the panels introduced by my honourable friend's amendment would wait until the 2 doctors have submitted their statements on the applicant and then scrutinise those statements. If they spot problems with the way the doctors have determined that the patient is not being coerced, then yes, they would call for the patient in for more scrutiny. But they will have to first come to that conclusion without seeing the patient. This is not a very robust safeguard.
I thank you for giving way, and I'm just in the process of tabling an amendment which would actually, to that effect, change it. That's the panel would speak to the patient, so hopefully that provides some reassurance for her. I'm sure that we're working very effectively through the committee process to achieve what we all want to see.
I'm grateful for the honourable member for her intervention, and I'm pleased to hear that she will be tabling further amendments. I haven't seen the amendment, so I can't speak to that amendment. And I would slightly beg to differ on just hold just a gentle reminder, I'm not convinced that we are. I think we're making good progress, but I also feel that closed stand part I voted against, and the other one I voted with lots of concerns. So we'll agree to disagree on that one in terms of its making progress in the way that certainly for me it hasn't made the progress that I would have liked to have seen. The NGO, other half, observes in its written evidence to this committee, which is number TIAB 104, the bill makes no provision to identify family members who may benefit financially from the death of a patient, and therefore the bill is unable to protect the vulnerable. And that's something I've said before in this bill committee, Chair. This amendment makes training in respect of financial abuse mandatory. It is vital that a medical practitioner is trained on how to identify coercion. We can all agree on this, but coercion is different from domestic abuse. Coercion may be relatively obvious to spot. In contrast, coercive and controlling behaviour is much less obvious. It can be subtle, it can be hidden, unexpected to an outsider. It requires much more sensitive questioning and the degree of a doctor-patient relationship to identify. Multiple people have raised that a patient-doctor relationship is important for spotting this. Currently, there is nothing in the bill to say that the two independent doctors have to have met the patient before. Speaking just to that subtle coercion, it could have happened over years. We've heard from people who have given evidence repeatedly that actually it is really, really hard to spot. And the reason it's hard to spot because it is a matter of trust. For a patient to be able to tell somebody, for a victim of coercive control, to be able to express that actually this is, or even recognise that there is subtle coercion going on, is hard for victims of that coercion to understand. And if there is domestic violence, and again I say it in this chamber, I have, when I first was campaigning in the mid-90s around domestic abuse, the stats there, and I'm not convinced they've changed much, and I will refer to some more later on as I make progress. It takes women on average 40 times to leave an abusive partner. 40 times. And to myself, it took me a long time to leave my abusive post-marriage when I was very young. The coercion that happens is so subtle. And again, when it's repeated coercion, when it's repeated, it's hard to even recognise it as a victim, let alone for a professional to be able to see. And even when a professional may pick up on it, it's acknowledgement from the victim, which is really, really important to recognise that is what's happening. And that often isn't the case. Multiple people have raised that a doctor-patient relationship is important. Again, there's nothing currently in this bill that ensures that there is a long-standing relationship between the doctor and the patient. Therefore, it is unreasonable to assume that someone in an abusive relationship or experiences coercive and controlling behaviour on top of their terminal illness would be willing and able to disclose this to a stranger, even if that stranger is a doctor. On top of this, there is research suggesting that a significant proportion of medical staff in the UK do not feel that they have had adequate training to spot domestic abuse. Research by YouGov and the charity Save Lives in 2018-19 found that half of UK healthcare professionals are untrained to spot domestic abuse. I understand the current difficulty of ensuring doctors have a prior relationship with patients. It may not be practically possible. In many occasions where patients will know their doctors or know them well, it is even more vital that both doctors have been thoroughly trained in spotting coercive control behaviour. Like the other MPs, Labour MPs in the room, I was elected on a manifesto pledge to halve violence against women and girls within the next 10 years. We must not forget that as we scrutinise this legislation, I want myself and my colleagues to remain committed to this in this bill. This bill will have particularly grave consequences for women, since we know that domestic abuse disproportionately affects them. The Crime Survey for England and Wales estimated that 2.3 million people aged 16 years experienced domestic abuse in the year ending March 2024. Of those, 1.6 million were women and 712,000 were men. In the same year, there were only 51,183 domestic abuse-related prosecutions. That's a very small number compared with a number of people who experience domestic abuse. And that's in addition to the elderly abuse, the abuse of our elderly, which Age Concern have submitted their evidence. These figures demonstrate how we already frequently struggle with bringing domestic abuse cases to prosecution stage. It shows that even the dedicated members of our caring professions have trouble in detecting domestic abuse. If someone is hard, then we need to train our doctors if something is hard, then we need to train our doctors how to do it. Our society already diminishes the status of elderly infirm women, and I have concerns with this bill that will further entrench this. With this bill, we need to be aware of and ensure we address the problem of mercy killings. This is distinctly a gendered issue, and this bill is currently worded, the way it is worded will have a distinctly gendered impact if we do not try to address this. Our society already diminishes the status of elderly infirm women, and I have concerns that this bill will further entrench this. With this bill, we need to be aware of and ensure we address the problem of mercy killings. In 2024, again, the other half carried out a review of more than 100 UK cases of so-called mercy killings. They found that mercy killings are not wanted, hastened deaths that need assisted dying. Instead, the review found they are overwhelmingly violent domestic homicides of women by men, and show that our society is still poor at detecting and responding to domestic abuse. Some groups are more vulnerable to domestic abuse than others. The same report found that the higher portion of people aged 16 years and over with a disability, where disabled people experienced domestic abuse in the last year than those without a disability, a group that we know is vulnerable in relation to this bill. The law and Parliament have, unfortunately, taken a very long time to even start adequately responding to these problems. Coercive control was first recognised as a distinct offence in English law only in the Serious Crime Act of 2015. As written, this bill would not mandate training to the doctors, whose role it would be to consider assisted dying cases. Of course, no training can be perfect, but to allow the bill to go forward without ensuring that doctors do have training in this complex matter would be negligent. It would mean that we were failing to even try to carry out our responsibilities to protect people, especially women, in abusive and coercive relationships. And I appreciate the member for Spen Valley has said she will be accepting this amendment, but it doesn't go far enough. The question is, how do we prevent abusers from making use of this bill if it does become law? This amendment gives us one way of mitigating that risk to a degree. We already have issues recognising domestic abuse. This amendment cannot perfectly solve this problem, but it does take steps, Chair, in doing so. We must safeguard vulnerable people who live subject to coercive and controlling behaviour on a daily basis, from opting for assisted dying as a result of that environment. Thorough and specific training on spotting this is vital for doctors, and I'm grateful that the member for Spen Valley is going to be making sure that she, in accepting this amendment and also ensuring some of that training will be forthcoming. I say that even one person being driven to there by abuser using assisted dying is one too many, and I'm confident that all the members would agree with me on this deeply important point. In the last few days, I've also been looking at suicide, because one of the issues that has come up is, for the first time in our history, we have suicide that has actually overtaken. So suicide from victims of domestic violence has overtaken deaths from what we would consider or term intimate partner homicide. And that was the first time. That was last year. And then in the last 2 weeks, there have been further reports which have again highlighted that victims of suicides, women driven to suicide because of the experience of domestic violence, has risen. So it overtook. In this House tomorrow, as she has always done, the member for Yardley will be reading the names of every woman who died, who has been killed in the last year. 2 of those women were my constituents, and there's many, many more that are victims. They literally kill themselves. They killed themselves to get away from the abuse.
Hold on. Sit down. I understand where the Honourable member is coming from, but I think she's very, very close to moving outside the scope of the actual amendment. So can I just ask you to bear that in mind? As I've said before, it's a very sensitive issue and I'm giving people latitude in this, but I'm afraid that latitude can't go too far. I don't want to interrupt people in the middle of speeches, but I will in future if members do not stick within the confines of the amendment. Masha.
I'm grateful, Chair, and I will be bringing it back to the issue on the amendment, which is related to training. I will also be bringing it back to the issue of interpreters. One of the reports which was released last year, November 2023, was a group called IMCAN, and it literally is life and death. And they talked about interpreters, and they talked about training. And one of the issues, and where I am talking about minoritised women, and the use of interpreters. And what they said, the availability and use of good quality interpreting services can be critical to women's access to safety and protection. The current position on police use of interpreters breaches both the Equality Act as indirect discrimination. Now, I appreciate the issue is about policing in terms of their training, and it also breaches the commitments under the Istanbul Convention. But surely the principles are exactly the same, because we have a service which has the police, the domestic violence services, which support victims of coercive control, which support victims of domestic violence. And they, unfortunately, come into contact with it, just like our NHS does, just like our medics do, way too often, for my liking.
Order. The issue of interpreters is not within this group. I'm just trying to look for that, and it isn't within this group. So I'm afraid the Honourable Lady's out of scope in relation to this clause, in relation to interpreters. It's in a later group, so perhaps you could pick it up there.
I thank you, Chair. My apologies that I had made the mistake, but I was referencing in relation to the Honourable Member who was talking about the use of languages, which is matter for one of these amendments, is my understanding. But once again, I'm happy to be guided by the Chair. Coming back to the issue of training, and domestic violence. When it comes to, so we heard in committee evidence from Dr. Jamila, and Dr. Jamila gave evidence about minoritised women. And again, from the data collection of ethnic minority groups, training is right at the top. Be it whether it be training through, whether it be the training of doctors, specialists. When it comes to the use of language, language is important when it comes to training as well. Because if we are talking about people who are training or trained to look at coercive control and to spot that coercive control, often, Chair, there is a use of an interpreter in between that victim who is being assessed. For there may be in this bill an ethnic minority woman or a man from an ethnic minority background whose first language is not English. And then, therefore, that training would need to include the cultural sensitivities in relation to spotting coercion, in relation to spotting control, in relation to repeated coercion in particular, Chair. And these are subjects that are already taboo for people to discuss. We know the issue of domestic violence, and it's hard to spot. We have repeated that time and time again, as have others, and have made reference to it. The truth is, when we're talking about training for people, this has to go further when it comes to victims or people seeking assisted dying who are from ethnic minority backgrounds, who have different cultural understandings. Like I talked about yesterday, also the member for Reigate also talked about the issue of the understanding of assisted dying amongst ethnic minority communities are very, very different if you have a language barrier. So what I would like to ask the Honourable Member, the sponsor of this bill, is how will her amendment go further in addressing some of those inequalities, some of those intricacies which are presented when we are dealing with women from ethnic minority communities in particular, or generally elderly people from ethnic minority communities, and I'm not sure how her amendment will be. I'd be happy to sit down and talk to her and talk through all of these issues so that we can ensure that I can support the development of that amendment to address some of the concerns that I've raised here today.
Will she give way?
Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful. The Honourable Lady was talking a little earlier about the tragedy of victims of coercive control who commit suicide. Does she consider that the amendments that we're looking at will help address that challenge? And what specific support do you think victims of coercive control would need to prevent them from taking this terrible step?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and he asks a very, very important question. Often when I'm looking at reflective services for black and minority ethnic communities, and I deliver training on this, and it's something I've done from my previous role, what I often say is I use the issue of my mother, who was a victim of domestic violence, and I often say, had she been arrested by a woman instead of a man, her experience might have been different. Had she been interviewed then, had a solicitor who was a woman, not a man, her experience might have been different. Had she had judges who were women, who were not men, her experience might have been different. Now, add another layer to that, and the layer is that had that person been from the background that she was from, they might have understood it. Had it been a woman, again, a police officer from that background. In relation to assisted dying, in relation to people asking about potentially going down this route, it is helpful if somebody has a cultural background. And that same analogy applies to these patients potentially. So if a female who has been a victim of domestic violence or coercive control, and she meets a doctor who is a specialist, who looks very similar to himself, white middle-class male, and he doesn't have that cultural understanding, he will then rely upon training. He will then rely, no doubt, upon an interpreter to translate. So those are the kind of things that I'm trying to tease out. These are the kind of protections I want in this bill. I want to see them in this bill, that we have if we want a Rolls-Royce service, and if this is going to be the bill that is the best in the world, then it cannot ignore those that are the most vulnerable in society. And that, if you have a disabled woman, there are added, it's like whammy upon whammy and layers upon layers of intersectionality that this bill does not address for me. That is why I want to see this bill strengthened. I want to talk about the training that the doctors get. I want to talk about the training in palliative care. We've already heard from Dr. Jamila. Dr. Jamila was very, very clear. The fear amongst people, minoritised communities, those people, because of what happened in COVID, their DNRs, all of this experience, some people potentially died that could have been prevented from dying because they didn't have the trust in the NHS services to actually go back and access those services. So in this instance, it is absolutely important. We have a first doctor. That first doctor, if the doctor or the people around that doctor have no relationship with this person in the first place, and this is the first doctor they're meeting, because their regular doctor, so for example, if it was Bradford West, you have a patient who has had a diagnosis of terminal illness, and they might well have a doctor, a consultant, who, like the Honourable Member pointed out, I think it was last week, has been dealing with them for 6 months, maybe even a year, for their diagnosis, up to the point it got to a terminal stage. They might have a relationship with that doctor who might have spoken their language, who might be from a particular faith background, who does not want to engage in the assisted dying process. That doctor would then have to, according to this bill, refer that patient on to somebody who's prepared to have that conversation. Then they might refer them on to a person who's having that conversation, who doesn't have that training, who doesn't have the language skills, who might...
I understand the Honourable Lady, but can we keep it particularly in relation to the clause 20? And I've looked at other potential clauses where this is relevant, 186C, but I'm afraid that's been starred. I do exhort the Honourable Lady to focus in relation to the particular issue around clause Amendment 20. Sure.
Thank you, Chair. My understanding is this all relates to Amendment 20, and the reason it relates to Amendment 20, and I'm happy to clarify that, is because ultimately this is about the professional's intervention with a patient. And the amendment was about training people adequately to assess coercive control, to assess domestic violence, to repeated coercive control. And what I'm trying to demonstrate, perhaps I'm not doing it well enough and I accept that, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there is a pathway and a catalogue of things that relate back to that person who is being assessed. And I'm trying to explain to the committee in detail, because I feel very strongly about it, to understand that what that care pathway might look like for somebody, and why, again, this bill doesn't adequately, this amendment in particular, whilst I welcome it, Chair, it does not safeguard against those that are the most vulnerable in society. I'm happy to be guided if that's not what I'm doing, but that is what my attempts certainly are. If I may carry on, Chair.
Well, can I just say to the Honourable Lady, is that, and you take this in the spirit it's intended, dipping in and out of issues throughout the course of your speech is okay, but I'm afraid the dipping in and out of issues which are not relevant and making this, we're getting to the stage where the information you're imparting to us is not necessarily relevant in significant elements to the amendment that we're actually dealing with.
Thank you, Chair. I would argue otherwise. I would say that actually everything...
Chair. My ruling is the Chair. It cannot be challenged. So I just exhort the Honourable Lady to stick to the amendment before us. If she doesn't, I'd have no other option but to intervene and move the debate on. Last shot.
Thank you, Chair. Coming back to the issue of coercive control, potential coercive control, which is what this amendment speaks to. As I've outlined, there are people in positions, patients, who could be in those positions. And given the examples that I've put before the committee, I would argue that Amendment 20, whilst is absolutely brilliant in terms of getting us to a better place than where we have started out with this bill, I would again, and I'm pleased that the sponsor member has indicated that she's happy to discuss this to strengthen the safeguard. I would urge the honourable member to, and again, the reason I feel that this amendment doesn't go far enough is for those very reasons that I have outlined, and no doubt I will outline further on when speaking to further amendments during the course of this bill. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. As I've said, the government remains neutral, and my role here is not to offer a government view on the merits of these amendments, but to provide a factual explanation of their technical and practical effect to assist the committee in its scrutiny. The government also remains committed to ensuring the legal robustness and workability of all legislation, and for that reason has worked closely with the member for Spen Valley on some amendments to the bill. Where changes have been mutually agreed by the sponsor and the government, I will also offer a technical, factual explanation and rationale for these amendments. This includes amendments 185 and 186 in this group. The government continues to remain neutral on this bill and does not have a position on assisted dying. This group of amendments relate to the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor. As currently drafted, the bill in Clause 5 gives the Secretary of State a power to specify the training, qualifications and experience required for a registered medical practitioner to act as a coordinating doctor, but there is no legal duty for the Secretary of State to do so. Amendments in this group either seek to change this power to a legal duty or introduce specific training, qualifications and experiential requirements for a registered medical practitioner to act as a coordinating doctor. Amendments 185 and 186, tabled by the member for Spen Valley, introduce a duty on the Secretary of State to make regulations regarding the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor, rather than merely having a power to do so. This will ensure that there is certainty as to the training, qualifications and experience the registered medical practitioner must have in order to act as a coordinating doctor. The Secretary of State's duty in this respect would include making provisions within the regulations about training for coordinating doctors relating to assessing capacity and assessing whether a person has been coerced or pressured by another person. This amendment would also enable the Secretary of State, subject to the specific training requirements already mentioned, to delegate the determination of the training, qualifications and experience needed for a coordinating doctor to a person specified in the regulations. This would allow that determination to be delegated to a body or bodies with appropriate expertise in line with other aspects of training for healthcare professionals. Amendment A to 186. It's understood that this amendment to Amendment 186 seeks to add to the duty just outlined related to regulations to be made by the Secretary of State on training, qualifications and experience. The amendment would require the regulations to specify up-to-date training on reasonable adjustments and safeguards for autistic people and people with a learning disability. When deciding if this amendment is required, committee members may wish to know that the Health and Care Act 2008 requires that all CQC registered health and adult social care providers must ensure their staff receive specific training on learning disability and autism. This training must be appropriate to the staff member's role to ensure they have the right knowledge and skills to provide safe and informed care. Amendment 290 specifies that physician associates, doctors in training, grades, doctors in postgraduate training and doctors working in locum positions would not be able to act as a coordinating doctor. Physician associates are already excluded under the bill from acting as coordinating doctors as they are not registered medical practitioners. The operational impact of the amendment in respect of excluding doctors in training grades, doctors in postgraduate training and doctors working in locum positions would be to limit the registered medical practitioners who could undertake the role of a coordinating doctor to a subset of registered medical practitioners. New Clause 12, Amendments 335 to 337. 335 to 337 require that regulations on the training for registered medical practitioners to act as a coordinating doctor or independent doctor would need to be specialised training. Putting this requirement on the face of the bill may potentially limit the nature of the training that could be specified in the regulations and guide those charged with framing such requirements to more specialised requirements relating to provisions of assistance under the bill. New Clause 12 would also insert a new clause into the bill to make clear that a registered medical practitioner or other health professional is not under any duty to participate in training wholly or largely related to the provision of assisted dying services or to provide assisted dying services, even if they've carried out such training. In relation to both aspects of this amendment, I would draw to the committee's attention to the existing provision at Clause 23 of the bill, which states that no registered medical practitioner or other health professional is under any duty to participate in the provision of assistance in accordance with the bill. This right to opt out would not be impacted by the training a medical practitioner had undertaken. Amendment 52 places the Secretary of State under a duty to make regulations regarding the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor rather than merely having a power to do so. Such regulations would also need to include experience of managing terminal illnesses. A requirement rather than a power to make regulations on training, qualifications and experience will ensure that there is certainty as to the training, qualifications or experience a registered medical practitioner must have in order to act as coordinating doctor. This change has been proposed through Amendments 185 and 186. Requiring that the regulations specify experience of managing terminal illness may limit the number of registered medical practitioners able to act as a coordinating doctor. Putting this requirement on the face of the bill may have the operational impact of limiting the options that could be explored in the development of a training programme. Amendment 359 would require that the coordinating doctor must be the same person as the registered medical practitioner conducting a preliminary discussion under Clause 4. This amendment would have the additional effect of requiring the registered medical practitioner who undertakes the initial discussion to have met the specific training requirements and qualifications that the coordinating doctor will need to have met. This could have the effect of limiting the numbers of registered medical practitioners that can undertake the preliminary discussions. Amendment 340 will place the Secretary of State...
I'd just like him to clarify that point. He's suggesting that because there might be fewer doctors eligible, willing to conduct the preliminary assessment, we should not require it at that early stage. Is that what he's saying?
Minister?
Yeah, I thank him for his intervention. I think what we're trying to say is that the important thing here is to ensure that the regulations, when the Secretary of State brings them forward, that they have the hands of the Secretary of State are not tied too tightly, so that the Secretary of State is able to bring together the right people, to deliver the right training, to achieve the outcomes that are required through the regulations. Our assessment is that this amendment would in essence narrow the pool of people that are available to do the training, and that would seem to preempt the idea behind doing this through regulations, which is to ensure that you've got up-to-date training which is responsive to where we may or may not be 2 years down the line from this bill having its commencement. So it's about, I think, having that flexibility and that ability to build capacity. Amendment 340 will place the Secretary of State under a duty to make regulations requiring a coordinating doctor to have specific and up-to-date training relating to reasonable adjustments and safeguards for autistic people and people with learning disabilities. I would note that Amendments 185 and 186, if passed, will impose a duty on the Secretary of State to specify the training, qualifications and experience the coordinating doctor will need. The consequences of this amendment would be to require the Secretary of State to introduce a further requirement on the coordinating doctor to have undergone training relating to reasonable adjustments and safeguards for autistic people and people with a learning disability. In considering whether this amendment is required, I would note that the Health and Care Act 2008 requires that all CQC registered health and adult social care providers ensure their staff receive specific training on learning disability and autism. Amendment 427. This amendment would impose an obligation to take all reasonable steps to ensure the coordinating doctor is proficient in the Welsh language, if services or functions in the Act are to be provided to an individual in Welsh in Wales. The amendment does not make clear who is obliged to ensure these steps are taken, or who will assess and enforce whether fluent proficiency is met.
Would you give way? What he's referring to is the appropriate authorities, because areas related to training and regulation of registered practitioners in Wales is devolved to Welsh Government. Therefore, this is something that I'll be touching upon later, but I would beg him to approach this in that spirit.
I thank her for that intervention. I know we're coming on to the question of appropriate authorities. I absolutely see and understand the spirit in which this amendment is made. The challenge is just around the potential for it to lead to operational issues, such as, for example, a reduced pool of registered medical practitioners who are able to carry out the function of a coordinating doctor under this bill. So
that is exactly why the amendment includes all reasonable steps with that in mind. And that is reflected in other legislation where similar concerns have been expressed.
Yes, I thank her for that, and I think we go back to this point about what is the true significance of the measure in the 2011 Welsh Government measure, which sets a basic foundation for the duty of the Welsh Government to ensure that the Welsh language is provided through the Welsh NHS. And I think there's absolutely no debate about that point. That is nailed on. The question is just around whether to how we ensure that if we are to amend this bill along the lines that the Honourable Lady is suggesting, that it doesn't somehow create a lacuna or confusion in the system. And I think that's something where we need to sit down and discuss that to ensure that it's watertight. Whatever it is that we propose is watertight. It may be helpful to note, as in discussion of Amendment 413, that regardless of this amendment, under the Welsh Language Measure 2011, the NHS in Wales has a statutory duty to deliver their services to the public in both Welsh and English. This legislation gives the Welsh language official status in Wales, and the measure states that individuals in Wales should be able to conduct their lives through the medium of Welsh if they choose to do so. The Welsh Government's active offer for health is intended to support all staff across NHS Wales to provide a service in Welsh for patients without them having to ask for it. Turning now to Amendment 20, this amendment requires that regulations made by the Secretary of State on the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor would be required to include mandatory training relating to domestic abuse, including coercive control and financial abuse. Amendments 185 and 186, tabled by the member for Spen Valley, require that regulations made by the Secretary of State on the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor cover training related to assessing capacity and assessing whether a person has been coerced or pressured by another person. But I do note, as the Honourable Member for Spen Valley has just said, she is minded to support Amendment 20, which clearly would ramp up that requirement as previously discussed. As I've said, the Government has taken a neutral position on the substantive policy questions relevant to how the law in this area could be changed. However, to clarify the intent of the bill, we have worked with the sponsor in relation to Amendments 185 and 186 to place the Secretary of State under a duty to make regulations regarding the necessary training, qualifications and experience of the coordinating doctor. This would include specific training on assessing capacity and whether a person has been subject to coercion or pressure. I hope this explanation and my observations have assisted the committee, and I thank the committee for its attention. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Kim Leigh-Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I'll speak to my amendments 185 and 186 first. These are important changes which, as has been said by the Minister, will impose a duty on the Secretary of State to make regulations about the training, qualifications and experience required in order to act as the coordinating doctor. So moving from a may to a must places a legal requirement that such training takes place, which is a real strengthening of the bill. As at the moment, the bill gives the Secretary of State the power, but does not legally require him or her to do so. These amendments also ensure that regulations must include training about assessing capacity and assessing whether a person has been coerced or pressured by any other person. Chair, it is difficult for me, and I know colleagues appreciate this, to resist the temptation to put the entire training manual in the bill, because we all want to show the thorough approach that has been taken. But I appreciate that this does not always make for good, clear legislation and can be very limited in terms of flexibility and future-proofing. But given the importance of these two issues, capacity and coercion, I felt it was important that this level of detail was specified in the bill, as I know they are at the heart of so many of our deliberations on this hugely sensitive and important issue. Chair, on the proposed amendments to my Amendment 186, the member for Bexley, Heath and Crayford has, as always, made a compelling argument for his proposal. And whilst I do have some concerns, as expressed by the member for Penistone and Stocksbridge, that the amendment limits the number of disabled people who are covered and doesn't cover people with mental disorders, I do understand the concerns around autistic people and those with learning disabilities. I'm also very mindful that following our discussion yesterday, given that people with Down syndrome will typically have some form of learning disability, this amendment may help to address some of the concerns we had yesterday regarding ensuring that the bill meets their needs and takes them into consideration. So whilst I take on board the comments of the Minister about the Health and Care Act, I am minded to support the amendment for the member from Bexley, Heath and Crayford and work with him and others as necessary to make any further changes as the bill progresses.
Will the Honourable, my friend,
of course.
I appreciate my Honourable friend Giveaway, and I'm really grateful as well that she will be supporting my Honourable friend's amendment here. I know on very many occasions we're having a debate on the level of detail that should be on the face of the bill, and I fully appreciate that you don't want the whole training manual, and I won't go into the amendments I put on here around culture and trauma-informed care, because I do recognise they were much too detailed in that respect. But would my honourable friend agree with me, where possible, where it doesn't create unnecessary or unintended consequences or other loopholes, that we should give reassurance, not just to our colleagues across the House, but also members of the public who do want to see these sorts of things on the face of the bill?
I thank him for that intervention, and I agree. He's absolutely right. This is a huge change if this bill were to pass. We have got a duty to the public to show that we are including sufficient detail in the bill to provide reassurance in any way that we can. And to be honest, I would quite like to put the entire training manual in the bill, but I appreciate from a legislative perspective that isn't possible. But I do think there are occasions where, for the avoidance of doubt, we should be making clear on the face of the bill certain provisions, which actually brings me on to Amendment 20, tabled by the member for Lowestoft, who I know has a huge amount of experience and expertise in the field to which her amendment relates. Her amendment proposes that regulations under subsection 3A must specify that training in respect of domestic abuse, including coercive control and financial abuse, is mandatory. And at the moment, there are no safeguards for terminally ill victims of domestic abuse, financial abuse, coercive control. And that does concern me, and it feeds into the points that the member for Bradford West has made. If we have a terminally ill person, often a woman, as we know, who is a victim of domestic abuse or coercive control, and I can only imagine what a lonely place that is. And at the moment, that person is under no supervision. And sadly, there are instances where those people will take their own lives. They will continue to be the victims of their incredibly difficult personal circumstances on top of having a terminal illness, and that is an absolute tragedy. By opening up the conversation with doctors, with healthcare professionals about their circumstances, I think that has to be a good thing, and it has to create light and transparency on what must be an incredibly difficult situation. So, as has been discussed, the Amendment 20 would require the registered medical practitioner acting as the coordinating doctor to have undertaken the really important detailed training around domestic abuse, including coercive control and financial abuse. And as I say, I think that would really enhance those very difficult conversations. I met with the member for Lowestoft, and I know how passionately she feels about these issues, along with many other colleagues, and indeed myself, to be clear. I've taken our conversations very seriously, and I'm meeting with her again next week, along with a number of organisations who specialise in domestic abuse and coercive control, to discuss their thoughts in the relation to the bill. So I'm very pleased to support that amendment today. With regards to Amendment 340 from the member for Bexley and Crayford, my understanding is with the support of 186A, it wouldn't be necessary to support 340. That is my understanding, as I believe they essentially do the same thing. In terms of new clause 12, I've taken on board the comments of the Minister around the consequence of the amendments related to that, in terms of the fact that it could limit the nature of the training. And I also concur with what the Minister said, that this clause isn't necessary, even though I understand the sentiment behind it, as we have got clause 23, which is very clear, Chair, that there is already no obligation to provide assistance by medical practitioners or health professionals. And I think in response to the amendment table 427, I do think we covered that point yesterday, but as I've said, I'm very open to continuing those conversations to ensure that the Welsh language is fully respected within the provisions of the bill. Thank you, Chair.
Does the Honourable Lady wish to give way? No, okay. In that case,
Chair, point of order, if I may.
point forward to Jack Abbott.
It's just to seek clarity on the point my honourable friend there made around Amendment A to 186 and 340. I think my honourable friend said there, if Amendment 1A to 186 was passed, there would be it would negate the need for 340. Can I just have clarity of whether that would be the case?
It's that, yes, that actually, it's not for me to make that decision. I just wanted to confirm that with the clerk, but no, it's not for me to make that decision. Now, in that regard, Amendment 290 proposed clause 5 is on the amendment paper. Does Nashar, the Honourable Lady, wish to move that to a vote?
I beg to move.
Okay. Amendment 290 proposed to clause 5 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Contrary, no.
No.
Division.
Division, wait a second.
Happy to proceed? Indeed, yes, we are. Okay, division. Lock the doors. Clock.
Jack Abbott.
Aye.
Lewis Atkinson.
No.
Juliet Campbell.
Aye.
Bambos Charalombos.
No.
Daniel Francis.
Aye.
Sarah Green.
No.
Rachel Hopkins.
No.
Sojourn Joseph.
Aye.
Stephen Kinnock.
No.
Danny Kruger.
Aye.
Kim Leadbeater.
No.
Kit Malthouse.
No.
Sarah Olney.
Aye.
Dr. Simon Ilfer?
No.
Rebecca Paul?
Aye.
Jake Richards?
No.
Sarah Sackman?
No.
Liz Saville-Roberts?
No.
Naz Shah?
Aye.
Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst?
No.
Dr. Marie Tidball?
No.
Sean Woodcock?
Aye.
The ayes were 9, the noes were 13, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. Amendment 185 to Clause 5 has already been debated with Amendment 290. I call Kim Leadbeater to move the amendment formally.
Move formally, Chair.
The question is that the amendment be made. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendment 335 to Clause 5 has already been debated with Amendment 290. I call Daniel Francis to move the amendment.
Thanks, Chair.
Amendment 335 to Clause 5 is on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no.
No.
Division.
Vision, consent.
Are we content to proceed? Those in favour, yes. Okay. Lock the doors.
No.
Lewis Atkinson?
No.
Julia Campbell?
Aye.
Bambos Sharalamba?
No.
Daniel Francis?
Aye.
Sarah Green?
No.
Rachel Hopkins?
No.
Sojourn Joseph?
Aye.
Stephen Kinnock?
No.
Danny Kruger?
Aye.
Kim Leadbeater?
No.
Kate Malthouse?
No.
Sarah Olney?
Aye.
Dr. Simon Ilfer?
No.
Rebecca Paul?
Aye.
Jake Richards? Sarah Sackman?
No.
Liz Saville-Roberts?
No.
Naz Shah?
Aye.
Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst?
No.
Dr. Marie Tidball?
No.
Sean Woodcock?
Aye. The ayes were 8, the noes were 14, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. We now come to Amendment 144 to Clause 5 in the name of Liz Saville-Roberts, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendments 145, 146, 147, 148, 149, 150, 151, 152, 153, 154, 155, 156, 157, 158, 159, 160, 161, 162, 163, 164, 165, 166, 167, 168, 169, 170 and 171. I call Liz Saville-Roberts to move Amendment 144.
To move all those amendments, all those 20 amendments. Thank you very much, dear David. And I rise to speak to amendments 144 through to 171 tabled in my name. And as Professor Emma Lewis of the University of Aberystwyth told this committee in our evidence stage, because this bill is a private member's bill, it hasn't gone through the usual process of engagement with devolved governments. And this is where these points are significant. I do recognise that there will be amendments and changes and amendments to amendments, but I can speak to the principle of this here, and I think we will have to adapt as we move ahead, as we are learning to do in this committee. Government of Wales Act 2017 formally acknowledged the Sewell Convention by amending Section 107 of the Government of Wales 2006 Act with a declaration stating, and this is important, that it is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom here will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the Senedd. It's in this spirit that work needs to be done to ensure the devolved legislature in Wales and the complexities of legislating across reserved and devolved matters are fully considered and represented with this bill. And that's what these 28 amendments seek to do. Now, the use of the term appropriate authority does two things. It recognises the complexity of which competency lies where and with which Minister or Secretary of State. It does that in the here and now. And it also future-proofs this legislation, which is something I think we know is important, if and when there are any changes to devolved powers, devolved competencies. The appropriate authority can move with time, with specifics as who is responsible for what. So I'll go through the amendments in some detail now. Amendment 169 amends Clause 40 to include a definition of what an appropriate authority actually is, the term that is used in my other amendments, what it is to mean the Secretary of State in relation to England and Welsh ministers in relation to Wales, where those powers are devolved rather than reserved. This amendment then provides for my other amendments that modify each relevant mention of powers provided to the Secretary of State within the bill to supply Welsh ministers with equivalent powers in Wales. So to return to Clause 5, which we're presently discussing, Amendment 144 allows Welsh ministers to have the same powers as the Secretary of State in England to specify training, qualifications and experience of the medical practitioner representing the coordinating doctor, because that matter is devolved to Wales. Amendment 145 similarly requires Welsh ministers to consult persons they consider appropriate before making those regulations in Wales. Amendment 146 amends Clause 6 to allow Welsh Government ministers equivalent powers to make provisions around proof of identity. Amendment 147 amends Clause 8 to do similarly in relation to training, qualifications and experience of the independent doctor. We're talking, of course, about the coordinating doctor here. And so on and so on. I assume my honourable friends now understand the purpose of my various amendments. I am more than willing to explain further if necessary. If I skip to amendments 155 and 156, these two amendments modify Clause 30 so that the Welsh Government has provided the power to issue a code of practice over arrangements in relation to this bill in Wales. This may be a useful lacuna, we're looking for, or a route in. This may be a useful route in for further discussions, possibly, if we are going to be able to specify some of the codes of practice. That may be an interesting route for us. So that also, I would perhaps be significant in discussions with the bill sponsor and the government about how to recognise legislative differences in safeguarding and the Welsh language, which we've been discussing earlier on as well. Also important are amendments 157 and 158, which provide Welsh ministers with the power to make regulations under Clause 32 to ensure assistance is available through the health service in Wales. This is the responsibility of Welsh ministers, and as my honourable friends know, Senedd Cymru voted against a motion to support an assisting dying law by 26 to 19, with 9 abstaining. So there are a number of issues of which we need to be aware in relation to bringing an England and Wales law into Wales here. Yeah, we cannot, we ignore it, frankly, at our peril, and we ignore it in a way that would be irresponsible. This is especially so when clauses 33 and 34 place explicit obligations on Welsh ministers and the Chief Medical Officer for Wales. I will put on record that I am disappointed that we weren't able to question the Chief Medical Officer for Wales. I understand that he was invited. I think that there is matters which we do not deal with every day in this place, which it would have been useful in this possibly, well, unprecedented certainly in terms of this being a private member's bill, the support and the information and the advice that we need, that would have been an obvious opportunity for us to have advice. And I do understand that the Chief Medical Officer has advised on other pieces of legislation, including vaping, although that was government legislation.
To give way on that point.
Yep, of course.
I thank you for giving way. Thank you, Chair. And just to confirm that the Chief Medical Officer for Wales was invited to give evidence. I don't know the circumstances quite as to why he didn't, but again, if it is helpful going forward for myself to meet with him or other colleagues to meet with him, the offer is definitely open.
Roberts.
Yeah, grateful, very grateful indeed for her intervention. So, just to move on now, I'll also mention amendments 161 to 165, which relate to clauses 35, 37 and 38. Making provision for the Welsh Government to review the operation of the Act in Wales, as amendments 161, 162 and 163 set out to do, is vital to understand the specifics of the Welsh context and to learn and adapt as appropriate. To not allow Welsh ministers this power would be to dismiss the particularities of health policy in Wales, alongside, of course, the additional implications of contextual differences, which I strongly believe we require an impact assessment for in order to understand them properly within the context of health being devolved to Wales, alongside possibly population, some significant population differences in relation to demographics and age and sickness within the population. And to ensure that health policy levers are fully retained in Wales, alongside the powers to adapt and tailor the operation of the bill to the specific context, it's crucial to the successful implementation of any legislation in that area, and the full consent and approval of Senedd Cymru is paramount. This is where we're talking about an LCM. This will be necessary, and I think it is significant when we come to an LCM point that we have had these discussions in this place before that is moved forward. That's also the basis of Amendments 164 and 165, which provide Welsh ministers with the power to modify Schedules 1 to 6 and make supplementary, consequential or transitional provision. This is an important measure as the forms introduced to the bill schedules are presently monolingual. You'll be aware by now, I think, that I've been raising matters particularly in relation to the Constitution, but also to Welsh language rights. And these will need to be done to adhere to Welsh language regulation in Wales. These forms must also be available in Welsh, and I think that very much is an issue for this place in the forms that are signed off by us. Amending Clause 40 through my Amendments 170 and 171 also provides the Senedd and Welsh Government with the rightful authority to ensure provisions are ready, adequate and enforceable in the Welsh context before their commencement in Wales, i.e. before the end of a 2-year period. I've set forth these amendments in an attempt to ensure Senedd Cymru, Welsh Parliament and Welsh ministers that they are provided with their correct and rightful powers in areas that are devolved to Wales, and that we are clear on that. That is what I have set to do in becoming a member of this committee. It's always been my stated aim. So I hope that my fellow committee members consider these practical amendments and will support their inclusion as part of this bill.
Thank you. Amendment 144 to Clause 5 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak briefly in support of the amendments, but also to ask whether, if the Honourable Lady wants to intervene, or to request that the Minister responds to a couple of additional points. I do think it's very uncomfortable that the bill does ignore the devolution settlement in this way. It feels regrettable that it was introduced in its current form, in the knowledge that the Senedd in Wales had rejected assisted dying a month earlier, and it either suggests that there was originally little thought given to including Wales in the bill, or that subsequent to that vote in the Senedd it was decided to impose the bill on Wales as well. And it would be helpful to have clarification about the original intent of the bill. I want to just very much echo the points made by the Honourable Lady. She's absolutely right about the appropriateness of giving these powers to the Welsh Government to manage the operation and the implementation of the Act if it passes. But I want to suggest a further and a stronger process of implementation, reflecting the advice given by Professor Lewis, who gave evidence to us on Welsh law, and his suggestion, in light of the vote in the Senedd that's rejecting assisted dying, he pointed out, and I quote, the vote was against the principles of assisted dying, not only about how the NHS in Wales might be affected. It was a decision which the majority of the Senedd made about these principles, having reflected on the issues raised. And he proposed a straightforward way of respecting that vote, while also recognising, if this Act were to pass, that it would apply to Wales. And he suggests that we should provide for different commencement provisions in the bill. As things stand under Clause 42, most of the bill will not come into force until the Secretary of State has brought it into force with the approval of the UK Parliament. Why not provide that the bill would only come into force in Wales when and if Welsh ministers bring it forth with the consent of the Senedd? It might be objected that this would create cross-border issues if Wales did not proceed while England did. Nevertheless, that's a matter that devolution can cope with. You'll have to cope with it if the Scottish bill doesn't proceed. There'll be cross-border issues there, and of course we have cross-border issues in respect to organ donation between Wales and England. So I don't accept that we need to have a uniform policy between the two countries. So I wonder whether either the Honourable Lady, but certainly the Minister, would comment on the suggestion that the commencement of the bill should only happen in Wales if the Ministers bring it forward with the approval of the Senate. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
I would wonder, the evidence for commencement date would evidently be associated with an impact assessment in Wales. And that is why it's so important that Welsh ministers have the power to get the information they need and the powers in actually implementing any changes that come forward.
I'm very grateful to her, and I absolutely agree. I mean, there's a whole set of challenges, including in England, about the impact assessment and commencement of the bill. Nevertheless, my suggestion is to strengthen the suggestion that she is making to empower Welsh ministers to proceed. I think actually my suggestion would be to her and to the committee that we should respect the devolution settlement, reflect what she describes as the correct and rightful powers of the Welsh Parliament to ultimately decide if this law were to come into effect in Wales. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Amendments 144 to 171 have been tabled by the member for Dwyfor Meirionnydd and relate to the powers and duties vested in the Secretary of State under the bill. The purpose of these amendments is to change all references throughout the bill from Secretary of State to appropriate authority. Amendment 169 adds in a definition of appropriate authority to mean the Secretary of State in relation to England and Welsh ministers in relation to Wales. I would note the sponsor's intent that the provisions in the bill extend and apply to both England and Wales. These amendments would mean that all the powers and duties vested in the Secretary of State are instead shared between the Secretary of State, where they relate to England, and the Welsh ministers, where they relate to Wales. I'd like to put on record the government's continued commitment to devolution and to working with the devolved governments. Having taken a neutral position on this bill and in the matter of assisted dying, the government is also still absolutely committed to working together with the Welsh Government to resolve legal and technical issues and discuss constitutional matters that might arise thoughtfully and amicably. With regard to the suggestions of the Honourable Lady and this phrase, appropriate authority, the challenge here is that in each case throughout the bill, the appropriate authority would be determined by the devolution position of the clause in question. So what is the underlying question that the clause is seeking to address, and is that a reserved matter or a devolved matter? So, I mean, having discussed this with Parliamentary Council and others, the concern is that a blanket provision of this nature may well be premature at this stage. So until we've finalised and determined the constitutional nature and impact of each clause, putting a blanket provision in place may run counter to that process.
A very simple question. In relation to the Sewell Convention, if not now, when? Because these answers, we should have clarity on these very points with the private member's bill being brought before us. Now, forgive me, this is slightly longer than an intervention, but he gives me no option in the here and now but to withdraw these amendments, because I'm not going to push them to a vote if they are likely to be lost. But these are serious questions. You know, how does this respect the Sewell Convention? And in all honesty, I, as a backbench MP, am not in a position to be able to answer this. And I would expect the government to come forward earlier than Bill Committee stage to actually have some clarity on exactly these points. I can assure him I will be pushing this at report stage if we do not have a satisfactory resolution to the Sewell Convention.
I thank her for that intervention. It's, of course, absolutely her prerogative to push amendments as and when she sees fit. I think the risk that is being flagged is simply that if you have terminology like appropriate authority, you risk tying the hands of the legislative process in a way that could have perverse outcomes. So you could potentially lead to a lack of clarity where, in fact, a clause which should be the lead responsibility of Welsh ministers ends up through process of the lack of clarity or relative vagueness of the term appropriate authority in the hands of Secretary of State instead. So the government's suggestion is to work through each clause and to be specific about the lead responsibility in each case. Is it a Secretary of State lead or is it a Welsh Minister's lead? But we're absolutely open to discussing whether it's better to do it that way or to do it but with the terminology appropriate authority, but simply flagging that there are some risks associated with the term appropriate authority.
Before you sit down, very briefly, will he commit to engaging with me on this in order to identify the specific needs within the spirit of what I brought forward?
Before report. Yes, absolutely, and before report. So let's ensure that we do that, and also ensure that parliamentary counsel is in the room. I am not a constitutional lawyer, and so I think we definitely need people in the room who can speak to these issues, and of course it also has to be done in close dialogue with colleagues in Welsh Government, particularly given what was said earlier about the need for a legislative consent motion.
Just, have you concluded?
Thank you, Chair. I've concluded my remarks.
Can I just, for clarity, in relation to this one, amendments that are negated at this committee, if you did push it today, can be tabled again at report stage. So, just for your clarity, if you did wish to move and it was defeated, okay, just absolute clarity on that particular. Well, I think there was absolute clarity from me on that particular one. Kimberly Peter.
Thank you, Chair, and I welcome this really important debate about the impact of this potential legislation on Wales, and I thank the member for Marinid for her really valuable contributions. I also welcome the comments from the Minister committing to meet with her and hopefully myself to have these discussions with Parliamentary Council and relevant authorities. This is really important. The criminal justice system covers England and Wales, and it's therefore important for this bill to do the same, given that it disapplies the Suicide Act in certain very carefully defined circumstances. But health is, of course, devolved, and the Welsh Government makes decisions, quite rightly, on the Welsh NHS. I want to make it clear that I recognise this reality and its importance, and I'm fully committed to observing the same conventions the Government would do if this was a Government bill. As has been said, I am working with the UK Government officials to ensure that the right steps are taken at the right time, and I would expect to engage colleagues in the Welsh Government as the bill progresses. Indeed, I really look forward to doing so. I'll be very happy to visit the Senate if appropriate, although as you can tell I do need to work on my Welsh a little bit, but I do look forward to continuing those conversations going forward.
Thank you. Liz Saville-Roberts, the Honourable Lady's indicated you wish to withdraw the amendment.
Yes, to withdraw, please.
Is everyone content with the amendment to be withdrawn? Aye. Those in favour, aye. As many of their opinions say aye. It's contrary, no. Amendment 52 to clause 5 has already been debated with Amendment 290. Does any member wish to push Amendment 52 to a division? No. Okay, in that case, withdrawn or not moved. Amendment 359 to clause 5 has already been debated with Amendment 290. I call Danny Kruger to move the amendment formally. Thank you. Amendment 359 to clause 5 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. No. Division. Are members content to move on? Lock the doors.
Jack Abbott? No. Lewis Atkinson? No. Juliet Campbell? No. Vamos Sharalambos? No. Daniel Francis?
No.
Sarah Green?
No.
Rachel Hopkins?
No.
Surgeon Joseph?
No.
Stephen Killick?
No.
Danny Kruger?
Aye.
Kim Leadbeater?
No.
Kit Malthouse,
No.
Sarah Olney,
Aye.
Dr. Simon Ofer,
No.
Rebecca Paul,
Aye.
Jake Richards,
No.
Sarah Sackman,
No.
Liz Saville-Roberts,
No.
Naz Shah,
No.
Dr. Neil Shaftry-Hurst,
No.
Dr. Marie Tidball,
No.
Sean Woodcock.
No.
The ayes were 3, the noes were 19, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlocked. We now come to Amendment 360 to Clause 5 in the name of Danny Kruger, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendment 361. I call Danny Kruger to move Amendment 360.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment speaks to the general confusion we remain in about how the assisted dying law would be implemented, who would operate it. We are in a great cloud of unknowing about whether we are talking about an NHS service or a private service. And the amendments that I'm proposing would clarify the obligations if there were to be a private service and people were to be paid to deliver it outside of the NHS, how their remuneration would be recorded. Now, there is an established precedent for publishing financial interests where there is a potential for a conflict of interest. And senior officials in NHS England, NHS trusts, or the MHRA must declare financial interests, including relationships with pharmaceutical companies, in public registers. It would include consultancy fees, gifts, hospitality, shareholdings in pharmaceutical companies, or research funding, because there is a concern that they influence drug approvals, procurement, or healthcare policy, and that there is a risk of bias. The NHS England Managing Conflicts of Interest guidance also encourages detailed disclosure for significant payments from pharmaceutical companies, often with exact figures or ranges if above a certain threshold, £500, for instance. The Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry runs Disclosure UK, which requires pharmaceutical companies to publicly report payments to healthcare professionals and organisations. So I think it would be appropriate to follow this well-established precedent and ensure that people involved in the administration of assisted dying are accountable for transparency for their remuneration. Now, Clause 5, subsection 3 of the bill recognises there could be a conflict of interest, and that there is a risk that someone who is related or might benefit financially may not be a neutral assessor of someone who wishes to die. But in Clause 40, subsection 4, which I think is rather late in the bill, it should be up front, the bill specifies that a registered medical practitioner is not to be regarded as benefiting financially or in any other material way from the death of a person, by reason only of the practitioner receiving reasonable remuneration for the provision of services. So here is when we discover that there is remuneration envisaged, but people being remunerated are excluded from the definition of people who are financially benefiting from the service, which feels to me dangerous. So the bill clearly envisages, having not resolved whether this is to be an NHS service or not, it does at least envisage a private market for these services will be established, perhaps with a specialist service like Dignitas. So, are we content with the assertion in the bill that remuneration is not a matter for scrutiny? I would like to know at what level we would consider reasonable remuneration to be, what would exceed reasonable remuneration. Would it be remuneration that's capable of influencing a doctor's thinking? Would they be paid on a per-patient basis or as a cumulative practice for administering assisted death? Should we not, as MPs, have some unease at the idea that this could be a highly profitable specialism for private practice? Now, I suggest that transparency on what is being charged, who is profiting from the service, would help us understand what is happening in the system that's being established. I suggest we just bring more sunlight into the system, as we do in many other respects. Now, it is notable there is little public data on what is charged, in other countries, where it's a private service, or indeed how much revenue assisted dying generates from medical practices. I think that's regrettable in the data we have from other jurisdictions, and I hope we won't be replicating that here. We do know that at Dignitas, which is a not-for-profit, the cost is between £5,000 and £8,500 in fees alone for the service for a single patient. So again, what is reasonable remuneration for a practice providing assisted dying here in the UK? The term is entirely undefined, and I'd be grateful for any clarity.
Would you give way?
Happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way, and I understand his keenness to get onto the debate that will be around clause 32, around the provision of the service, and we will come to that in due course. I think this conversation is about this particular amendment, but to be very clear, there is no anticipation that assisted dying would be set up as a private enterprise or a private service. It would be delivered within the provision of the NHS.
Danny Kruger.
Well, I'm glad to get that suggestion from the Honourable Member. I mean, notice clause 32 is extremely broad. It basically empowers the Secretary of State to set up a service in any way they choose, including potentially in the private sector. So she might say that it's not envisaged that would happen. She's suggesting this should be an NHS service. I think that I'm grateful for the clarity. I wish that were clearer in the bill, because it would enable this. Well, it will be, she says. So we're going to have more clarity on how this Act would apply. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I think including assisted suicide as an NHS service is fraught with enormous risks along the lines that we've discussed, and no doubt we'll continue to discuss. But if at least we do have that clarity, if she's going to rule out private provision and profit-making or remuneration of people outside the NHS, then I'd be grateful for amendments that would specify that, because it would help address this question. And my amendments will make it clear that if there is private provision of assisted suicide, as the bill is currently drafted would allow, the public and Parliament will be able to understand who's being paid what, and I think that's very appropriate. Happy to give way.
I appreciate the Honourable Member giving way, and just a sense of clarity for the committee about what the Honourable Member is driving here. Is the Honourable Member saying, I just want the finances out there in the public domain so we know exactly if it goes down a private route, for example, that everybody would know what a private individual may be charging for these services? Or is he suggesting a cap on services? Can I just clarify what the Honourable Member is really intending to do with these amendments?
Danny Kruger.
I'm grateful. Well, my amendments state that if a medical professional is paid for delivering assisted suicide, the amount of money they get should be made transparent. So the answer is the former of the two options he gave. I'm not proposing any cap. If we do end up with a private service, although we've just been told we won't, it might be appropriate to create a scale of charges. But my suggestion is we just need absolute clarity. I also think, by the way, that the procedure for the regulations around this, the transparency of finances should be set by the affirmative procedure. It should be something that Parliament deliberately approved. Happy to give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I think what the honourable lady was indicating was, and my interpretation is that as long as the service is provided and available in the NHS, as we currently have, it's up to me whether I go private or not. And in those circumstances, it's available in the NHS. I could have it on the NHS if I really want it. But if I choose to go private, as I might do if I'm having a baby at the Portland Hospital or having cosmetic surgery at the Edward VII Hospital here in Marylebone, why would you want to know what the private arrangement was between me and my private physician?
Danny Kruger.
Well, I'm grateful for the clarity, although we now seem to be less clear than we were, because I'd understood the honourable lady was saying there would not be private provision, and the right honourable gentleman is saying that there may be. So if she's going to clarify whether private provision will be allowed under the terms of the bill, that would be helpful, because I think we have perhaps it's a party split. My right honourable friend supports private provision. The right honourable lady suggests it should only be in the NHS. Let's hear.
I think this service will be delivered through a range of providers, as many other services are, as the honourable member has alluded to. And I understand, again, the keenness to have this debate and discussion now, but we will come on to these discussions further down the line. And you're right, it is really, really important.
I'm grateful. Well, it certainly is. Okay, so it's either. Either it could be delivered in the NHS, it will be an NHS service with all of the implications that means for general practice and doctor-patient relations and the way secondary care and social care works, but also there's the opportunity to deliver it privately without any clarity or transparency on who's being paid how. And my suggestion is, to my right honourable friend's point, this is different from cosmetic surgery. Even that is regulated. In fact, there's in many ways more regulation around the administration of Botox than there is for this bill. But actually there's a significant difference of category and of gravity in the administration of assisted dying, and I think it is appropriate and important, particularly with a new intervention that we are creating here, that the financial interests are clearly revealed and made public. So, Mr. Chair, I finish there, other than to suggest or request to honourable members that if they do not support this amendment, what provisions do they propose that would reveal where there may be potential conflicts of interests and how we might regulate those? Thank you.
Thank you. Amendment 36. Simon,
reply.
Just Amendment 360 to clause 5 was on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Simon Ofer.
I do apologise, Chair, for that, and I thank you. I thank the honourable member for East Wiltshire for this amendment. I'd like to just point out a few things. So, in terms of how this bill is set up, this is quite similar to a number of different other services on the NHS, and essentially, a medical professional will opt in to provide this service. So this will involve, as it does in Australia, extensive training followed by a short exam, after which they will be accredited to be a doctor under the scheme. And that's how I perceive that this will take place in the UK. This is also what's happened in California. No one is forced to do it, but it's offered as a training, and many doctors take this up. And so what then happens is that, so it's a medically based service. The BMA then negotiates with Department of Health about the fee involved for doing the assessment. That's not about agreeing to it, it's about doing the assessment. Okay, so this is mirrored in many different aspects of general practice, and general practice itself is a private service which is contracted to the NHS. So it's very, very complicated, and I think the trying to reveal this as a private service where people may profiteer is simply inaccurate, because this is based on medical professionals performing a duty which they are trained for, and which the price is very clear to the general public because it's negotiated and published. Can I just actually just continue a little bit? So if we then publish the number and fees that a single doctor has accrued from this, which is something that we do not do in terms of things like minor operations, which we perform outside of general medical services, but we are rewarded by the government at a set fee. There's other things, insertion of a coil, for example, we are given a certain amount of money, so it's very complicated how this is arranged. Appraisals, being a trainer, all these have a price attached, and we need training before we can perform it. And I see this as no different to that. And I think the problem is, if you then start publishing how much money or how many patients have been seen by a doctor in terms of assisted dying, that puts a target on that doctor. And as we have seen in terms of abortion clinics, and actually as we have seen during this committee, where certain members of the committee have been targeted by the press for what they've said, this is a very, very sensitive issue, and I think that it's just simply not fair to publish these figures so that doctors could be targeted in the press and be made to feel unworthy in all those ways that I'm saying. So it's extremely difficult. Yes, certainly. Yeah.
And he makes a powerful argument about... Thank you, Chair. He makes a powerful argument about doctors being vilified in the press, but does he also consider there's a risk that it may go further and it may present a genuine safety risk to those doctors?
Absolutely, and this is what worries me. And I acknowledge that the honourable member was saying about pharmaceutical sponsorship, etc. I don't think that's got anything to do with what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is specifying what doctors are doing as part of their daily job, which they are trained for. And I just simply think it's not fair to publish those figures and put those doctors at risk.
Thank you. I'm actually really appreciate the points that he's trying to make, because I've got mixed views on this. So I'd like to understand what would be appropriate, because my concern is that there's a difference here, because when doctors normally have them setups, they are for treatment options, and in this instance it's a service which is not an NHS treatment or a public, it's not a treatment, so to speak. So I just genuinely want to understand, what would a good service in his eye look like to give that scrutiny and accountability?
Yes, well, there are examples. So, for example, appraisal of other doctors is specified as a job which you're trained for, and indeed one which is paid at a set rate which is agreed with the Department of Health. So there are many instances where this occurs, and I agree totally that the fee that a doctor attracts for that service should be very clearly specified, and that should be in the public domain. What I don't agree with is that a single doctor should be identified as having seen, say, 10 patients who have requested assisted death. I think that's just unnecessary, doesn't lead to any increased safety for the patients and for the population, and actually will make it less safe for the medical practitioners as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. Amendments 360 and 361 have been tabled by the Honourable Member for East Wiltshire. They introduce requirements on the coordinating doctor. I will take the amendments in turn. Amendment 360 seeks to insert an additional condition into the definition of a coordinating doctor and would require a coordinating doctor who receives financial payment for providing assisted dying to make an annual statement declaring publicly their total turnover from providing the service, the number of people they have assisted, and any other information specified in regulations. Amendment 361 is linked to this and requires any regulations which specify the information to be made available must be subject to the affirmative procedure. It's not clear whether these amendments are intended to apply to both private and NHS providers. If this requirement were to apply to NHS providers, this could create difficulty, as the doctor is unlikely to know the total turnover from providing an assisted dying service. I'd add to this, as the Honourable Member for Spen Valley has said, the sponsor's intent is to ensure that the assisted dying service is available as an integral part of the NHS. Officials are working to develop amendments to later clauses of this bill to establish the operating model for the sponsor's consideration. I hope. Yes,
I thank the Minister for giving way. Would the Minister not think that the use of the word remuneration means that it's referring to the amount of income received by the doctor specifically, rather than any other organisation or company?
Well, as my honourable friend, the member for Stroud, has just pointed out, it's a very complex picture because there are tariffs for services, and doctors receive a tariff for a service across the entire panoply of everything that they do, particularly when you're looking at general practitioners who do a very wide range, provide a very wide range of services, and they are remunerated on the basis of a tariff that is negotiated in the GP's contract between the Department for Health and Social Care and primarily the BMA. So when you are a doctor operating in that environment, it is difficult to pick out exactly what the turnover you have made from a particular service is. And I would also say that, as the Honourable Member for Stroud has pointed out, if you like, picking out an individual doctor and saying how much money they've made from a particular service, whether it's assisted dying or any other service, does put a particular focus on that doctor. So I think what we're drawing a distinction here between what the tariff could and should be, which is something that I think we will need to come on to as we discuss this, the operating model in later clauses, but to move from being transparent about a tariff to saying that doctor over there made this much money from providing this service, I think is a whole new ballgame.
I'm grateful to him for that, because I think indeed, there are a number of points here. One is the extraordinary revelation that we're about to find out how this bill will operate in practice, with amendments yet to be tabled, even while we've been debating the bill for a couple of weeks. But to his point that there's a difference between the tariff and the income from the doctor, well, fine. But if the tariff is to be clearly specified, as no doubt it would be, how can there be a complication about determining how many tariffs a particular practice has received? There is a second question about whether it's appropriate to reveal that. I recognise that point. But what is the confusion about, why is it difficult to identify how many individual tariffs a particular practice has received? And further to my point, Mr. Chair, if I may, there's the tariff income is described. My other concern is about sponsorship, gifts, hospitality, fees of all sorts. The pharmaceutical companies are always trying to administer. So would he address the question of whether that should be transparent as well?
Minister.
Well, I think the challenge in his amendment is he uses this term total turnover. And for a GP to extrapolate from the service that is provided through to a whole range of other costs that may apply, for example, the share of overhead that they pay into their primary care network, the share of admin costs, the rent of the building. If you look at the definition of total turnover is an entire cost and an entire piece of revenue through the tariff. So as officials have made clear, is an additional level of complexity and would be an onerous task. Not necessarily impossible, but that's, I think, one side of this issue, because he's used this term total turnover. But I think the other is much more a salient point, which is around the quantum leap there is between having transparency on a particular tariff to pointing at a specific doctor and saying, you over there, you did this much work on that much tariff, and that's how much money you made for it. I think there's a big difference between those two.
Would the Minister give way?
I will.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I'm just trying to understand, and I actually agree, I don't like the idea of a doctor being identified in such a way, just like they have with abortion clinics. But what I'm trying to understand is, how would we protect those services if it is an NHS provision and it's a speciality which doctors in certain practices have actually signed up to providing services for assisted dying, becoming either the primary or the secondary doctor? Then by definition, those will be practices that people will refer to, and that will become common knowledge, and it will become, so for example, if it's a musculoskeletal service or if it's a podiatry service, so in this instance it would be assisted death service, so there will be clearly practices that wouldn't. So how would we then protect the doctors? How will the government respond to all of these things, these concerns?
Well, I thank you for that intervention. I mean, I think if we're specifically talking about the Honourable Gentleman's amendment, he is saying that the total turnover from providing this service should be publicly available, should be published. So I'm assuming he thinks that it should go onto a website that everybody can see. I think the question that she's asking is around knowledge that if you wish to seek an assisted death, you can go to a particular practitioner or service. That's absolutely baked into the bill, and clearly that is something those doctors who do wish to opt into this service will be doing so with their eyes open. They'll know that they're providing that service, and I think that we have to ensure that doctors feel protected. If there's a sense of risk, it would of course be deeply regrettable if there were to be threats or risks to doctors, but evidence suggests in other countries that it hasn't led to some of the deeply unfortunate things we've seen around abortion clinics, for example. So it doesn't seem to have led to that. But of course, we would always, as a government, need to be vigilant and monitor all of our services to ensure that our excellent medical professionals are getting the support that they need. So those.
I thank the Minister for that useful explanation. Does the Minister agree with me that the setting of the tariff is going to be very key, because that could either incentivise or disincentivise the provision of the service?
I agree. So, I mean, like any other aspect of what doctors and general practitioners do, it is based on remuneration. They are professionals, and they should be remunerated as such. So I think that will be important. I think it's important as well that we don't jump ahead into the definition of the operating model, which, as I've said, is something that officials are working on with the sponsor and will be made clear in the relevant clauses of the bill later on in our deliberations. I will be
Kimberly, Peter.
Is the Minister reassured, and hopefully colleagues as well, that if the committee agrees, the introduction of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Commission, monitoring would be very intense, reporting would be very robust, and that might allay some of the fears that have been raised today?
Well, I thank her for that intervention, and the government, as I've repeatedly said, the government's neutral on the fundamental questions of the bill, but we are absolutely committed to ensuring that if it does get its royal assent, it must be workable, and I think the role of the Commission will be absolutely pivotal in making sure that it is workable and that all of the necessary monitoring and evaluation mechanisms are in place.
It being 11:25 a.m, the committee is now adjourned until 2 p.m. Order.
Committee Room 10 sound. 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 Committee Room 10